Well, welcome. Welcome, welcome. I'm so glad to see you here. As I said earlier, this is our third week in our Faces of God series, and I'm loving this series. Next week, we're going to have Jeannie Ward talking about gender and God, and really kind of non-gender and God. So please join us for that. And after that, we're going to be closing up, well, not closing up, but we're going to be having a talk on the three faces of God, which is the concept I talked about 2 weeks ago. God as all there is, God as me, and God in relationship. What Ken Wilber calls the three faces of God. Today, what I want to talk about is the changing face of God in our changing society. So let me start with this story. So many years ago, my wife and I, we were visiting some friends up in Maine. And it was the summer, it was cold, Maine is small. I hope nobody here is from Maine, but it was small, it was nice. It was a beautiful little town, but there was not much to do. One of the friends that we were visiting a few years before that had undergone some theological training. I think it was Episcopal training. And so there was not a whole lot to do. Literally, one of the things I did when I was up on this vacation, I was not going to share this, but now it seems interesting, is there was a pile of wood and I moved it to one spot and then I moved it back. This is how we spent the vacation. Anyway, there was not much to do, so I was browsing in her library and I came across a book called The Theology of Liberation by Gustavo Gutierrez, and it was about a concept known as liberation theology. Now at this point I still was really not going to church all that much. I was a Episcopal by birth. I don't think I had started going to the Methodist church, and I certainly had not yet walked into New Thought. But I picked up this book, it just called to me, and I swear I could not put it down. It was riveting. This book about liberation theology. It gave me a view, a new face of a divine presence in our world, acting in our world, creating in our world, and my ability to create and act with it. For those unfamiliar with liberation theology, it's a notion that began in the Latin American church many years ago, and what it does is it looks at the Gospels, and instead of following really kind of traditional theory that we should help the poor, that we should aid the poor, what it does is it advocates a drastic restructuring of society to eliminate poverty, to lift the poor up, to give them equal opportunity with all the rest of us. It's been said to be kind of a cross between Christianity and Marxism. That may not be entirely accurate, but it is a call to radical social justice and the advancement of human dignity on a huge scale. And it also says that that is what Jesus taught us to do. That was the true message of the Gospels. And the liberation, the word liberation, is even taken from the Gospels. It's taken from Isaiah 61, where Isaiah says that the word shall liberate you. So it was extraordinary. And it was in the context of the Catholic Church. I was not Catholic, but it was just extraordinary. It gave me a new view that God calls to us to act, to liberate, to create, to serve, to be the hands and the voice and the feet, and this was the way to do it. It was so different than anything I had ever seen before in the walls of my Episcopal church, in the dogma and the doctrine of my Episcopal theology. I have never forgotten it. And it may very well be one of the main reasons I'm standing here today. It was years ago, but I still think about it to this day. It opened my eyes to the notion that the walls of traditional Christianity, and it's not just Christianity, I grew up a Christian, so I'm sticking with that in terms of this explanation, but it taught me that the walls of traditional theology are fluid. They are not as solid as we thought they were. They can move, they can change, they can expand, the circle can widen, the walls can even drop, depending on what we feel, what resonates with us, what Spirit calls to us to do. The circle was big enough to embrace these new ideas that resonated with me. I literally saw a different face of the divine, a new face to me, calling me to stand up and make a difference. Before, I had been just simply told to believe. Do y'all remember sitting in the pews and just being kind of told to believe? And just kind of putting energy into that? And that never really stuck with me. But this gave me something to do, something to be. The awakening I had on that day is a wonderful example of how we each in our own lives can experience a new, a transformative experience of God. It's a calling to us to see Spirit in a profoundly different and a deeply personal way. This, all around the globe, is what is emerging now as the many new faces of God. As we start to consider the new faces of God, it helps to take a look at the older ones. And again, this is a 20-minute talk, so I can't say this is the old face, this is the new face. What we're doing is we're drawing generalizations. There are millions of faces of God, and there always have been. But something in our culture has been going on that we have to see as a reaction against what was the prevailing view of God, what was the dominant view of God, at least here in the West. There has been a massive shift, and we all know it, and many of us have been a part of it. I think that's a large reason why a lot of us are here. So those of us alive in the 70s, okay, yes, we were alive in the 70s, remember an era, really we do, in which, I see faces, in which relationships were changed, in which the norms that we previously followed just fell away, one after another. Don't we remember that? Faith in government, obedience to authority, expectations about our careers, the obligations we had towards society, they all just fell away like dominoes, one by one. Where before we were simply told to obey, to believe, to conform, those rules were just blasted apart. They were examined, they were found wanting, and we just moved away from them. So these changes followed on the heels of the, quote, death of God theology that became popular in the mid-60s. And I learned this, again, this is Melanie, so this is trivia, in which our own Emory University played a large part. One of the major theologians of the death of God movement in the mid-60s was from Emory University. It kind of put Emory on the map. Yeah, that was interesting. So what we did is we moved from a culture of obligation, of have to, of expectations, to a culture of self-fulfillment, self-exploration, of the certainty that we had a right to be happy. Right? The ramifications of these changes were huge, and they touched all aspects of our individual lives and our communal lives. Think about it. Okay. Do you think 100 years ago anybody was interested in whether our grandparents were happy? Do you think anybody was interested in whether our grandparents were fulfilled? Whether they liked the job they were in? I don't think so. I think they did it because they had to, they did it because it was expected of them, and there was no question about it. The choices they had were so much narrower, the constraints on them were so much more binding. There was so little room for individual expression, for unorthodox behavior, for the freedom to be who they were. We take all this as givens. It is a huge gift. It's a huge responsibility, but it's a huge gift. And a lot of folks now coming up, they just take it as, well, this is the way it always was, but it's not. We are standing on the shoulders of people who just gave us that, who went through so many different journeys to just make that possible for us. So we see this freedom everywhere. Okay, I spent many years practicing law. In our law practice, we would hire new lawyers, 30-somethings or a little below 30-somethings, and they would come in and they would expect, I'm glad you're all seated, weekends off. Who does that? We would tell them that we had a project due that, I'm sorry, I'm going to the beach. I'm like, are you joking? Nobody told me I could go to the beach. I've worked here for 30 years, weekends included. But they would even quit for jobs making less money. Who does that? So that they could find, what's that word I'm searching for? Shout it out. Balance. That's not something we did. We worked hard. We didn't do that. We didn't know that we had the right to be happy. We thought we were just here to work, produce, and put one foot in front of the other. But they taught us, no, that's really not what it's about. So these cultural and these social transformations, they also have a spiritual ramification that just blasted open the doors of organized religion. So what happened? Religious authorities were no longer authorities, were they? No. Religious authorities, they might be guides, they might be teachers, they might be sources of inspiration, but we decide if we want to believe what they're saying. We don't believe it just because they're saying it. For those of us up here, that just kills us. I'm just joking. But you get the right. We all do it, to decide whatever resonates with us as we question all our cultural institutions. As Joan read, the church is not exempt. When I was growing up, my sister and I, we went to a high school that had chapel. It had chapel like every week. Okay. So we had a chapel that had a pulpit up in the wall. It was like up in the wall. And the minister who used to speak up there always used to joke that he was 4 feet above contradiction. I love that, 4 feet above contradiction. Okay, well now, nobody's above contradiction. Because you either buy it or you don't. But you don't believe it because I say it or because anybody up here is saying it. We seek for our own answers, and that's the way it should be. We find access to the sacred without jumping through all those doctrinal hoops that we were once told we had to jump through. So as we heard in our reading, cultural and social changes also affect our religious landscape. It is not, what's the word Joan used? Immutable. As we change, the faces of God change, our experience of God changes. Numerous studies report the significant decline in religious affiliation, especially among millennials, defined as those born after 1982. I also learned that millennials stop at 2004. So if you were born in 2004, there's a search on for a new name. So if you have any, just mail it in if you have any suggestions. But this lack of religious affiliation, it crosses all age groups. There's been massive growth in the number of people who call themselves nuns. Have we heard that? Tell me what religious affiliation you are. I'm really not. That's what they say. They call themselves nuns. They make up the second largest religious group in North America and in most of Europe. Think about that. In the United States, nuns make up almost a quarter of the population. In the past decade, U.S. nuns have overtaken Catholics, mainline Protestants, and all followers of non-Christian faiths. It's an amazing movement. It's like the tectonic plates of belief are shifting.
Earthquakes.
There you go, earthquake, yes. Even those who have affiliations are no longer sure they are where they need to be. 42% of churchgoers who have affiliations are dissatisfied or only moderately satisfied with their churches and are open to considering other options. That's a huge percentage, 42% these days. It's huge. So, do y'all remember that, or have you seen that famous Time magazine cover back in April of 1966, Is God Dead? That's our question. Is God dead? I don't think so. I think what happens is the exodus from traditional houses of worship, it does not mean that people are abandoning their search. It only means they are not finding it there. How many of, I know I am here because I didn't find it there. How many of us are here because it didn't resonate with us there? The connection to spirit, the experience of spirit, was not available for us or was not reaching us in those places. I think the exodus from traditional houses of worship, for many it still works, but for many it means that God is as vibrant as ever and continues to call us to new relationship, to new understanding, to make that vibrant, that personal connection. Spirit is yelling at us to wake up, to get up, to wake up, to step into that new understanding and that new experience. So the new face of Spirit is one in which we move beyond those traditional doctrines, those traditional creeds. We look past it. Yet we do not abandon the search for the holy or the sacred. We don't stop our search for God at the doors of the church. That is not where we find God anymore. What we're seeing more of, as we here at One World know, it's a more individual search for our own connection. And that's what Asha sang in your first song. It's a more personal search. It's God or Spirit or whatever name you are using that speaks to us. Institutions are not going to give it to us. We don't rely on them because we know that they cannot. When we started to question everything, we could not stop questioning that. And we were right, because what it does is it gives a new vibrancy to our relationship with Spirit. I mean, I remember when I was growing up in the Episcopal Church, we used to recite the Creed. Does anybody remember doing that? I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of... And that's how they said, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. These people should be 3 feet above the floor. They should be on fire. But that's what it had turned into. That's what happens when you let a living, vibrant belief, a A theology or a belief system that sets you on fire degrade, if you will, into just formulas, into just doctrine. So what we have is more people who are calling themselves spiritual but not religious, right? Isn't that what we hear? What are they saying when they're saying spiritual but not religious? What they're saying is, I know there's a universal power at work in this world. I feel it, I know it's there, and I am looking for my connection with it. But when I go to church, I don't find it. And so I need to keep looking. That is the long version of spiritual but not religious. These are not people who have given up. So the face of God is one, the new face is one we find on a journey that is inner directed. Nowadays, we expect to experience the divine, not just read about it, not just learn about it, or repeat about it. We expect to experience it. As author Diana Butler Bass writes, Christianity itself is changing, shifting away from being a belief-centered religion toward an experiential faith. And what does that call? And then not just Christianity. All the faith traditions are doing that because we are all changing. It's not just those of us in the West who are changing. We are all looking for that personal, meaningful connection. In 1962, pollsters found that 22% of Americans claimed to have had a mystical experience of God. 22%. Do you know what that number was in 2009? 48%. Now, does that mean God was showing up more often? No. It just means that people were expecting to have that experience, that they permitted themselves to have that experience, that when they had it, they knew what it was. They said, yes, that's what I'm having. I'm having a personal, a mystical experience of God. So we've heard it said that there are as many paths to God as there are souls on the planet. When we give ourselves the permission to find our own answers, our journeys truly become our own and no one else's. What is it Emily Cady said in Lessons in Truth? If you want to really advance your spiritual journey, stop reading so many books. Isn't that great? Just stop. Put it down. Just sit in the silence and communicate with God yourself. That will advance your own spiritual journey. And they're all individual. Look at the service we had last week with Melanie LeBaron and her fellow priestesses and high priestesses. Melanie described her experience of growing up in a very traditional Christian denomination, and then a few years ago just saying, this ain't for me. I'm not feeling it. This is not where God is for me, and stepping out. And now she's having services with priestesses and high priestesses and following a shamanic path. Do you think 100 years ago that would have happened? I'm guessing probably not, because now we have the freedom to do it. We have the certainty that it is something that we are called upon to do. That journey is being repeated by millions who now feel free to step away and find their own truth. So these new faces of God, what do they look like? They're going to look probably more interfaith, or multi-faith, or multi-religious. You might identify yourself as a Christian, but you also might say, I'm also a Hindu and a Buddhist, because there are things that I pull upon there. And it's not always going to be one silo, one silo, one silo. We know that here at One World. Our definition of interfaith is not Christians and Jews talking to each other. It's we get to pull from all these different experiences to fashion our own journey, because there is so much of value in all of it. And we learn about it and we apply it as it speaks to us. Today, over a third of Americans attend more than one religious community, and they mix practices from several different sources. That is great. And no one's telling them to do that. They're just following an inner call of, this is where I find God. And nowadays we have the freedom to do it. Our new understanding of God also gives us the freedom to take a fresh look at the religious traditions we already know. Liberation theology was a great example. What did Gustavo Gutierrez do? He was a Catholic priest in Latin America. And what he did is he looked at the Gospels and he said, wait a minute, there are a lot of references in here to the poor. There are a lot of references to how we need to raise up the poor. The Gospels do not elevate the rich. They don't say it's great to be rich. They say we are here to bring solace and comfort to the poor, to make everybody equal, to raise up those who are oppressed. And that's a new look he took at that ancient theology. He went back to what he saw as the original message. It enabled him to take a fresh look at ancient doctrine. Others do the same thing. We see a rise in the age of Christian mysticism. We see current Christian mystics like Richard Rohr, who talks about an experiential relationship with God. Thomas Merton, Thomas Keating, who taught us about contemplative prayer. We see, even in these established traditions, that people are saying it's still not enough just to have the dogma. I want the personal relationship. Author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, I love them, but he also wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And he gave a wonderful explanation, a wonderful description of what a living faith in that tradition meant to him. He wrote, though Christianity seems at the first to be all about morality, all about duties and rules and guilt and virtue, yet it leads you on, out of all that, into something beyond. One has a glimpse of a country where they do not talk of those things, except perhaps as a joke. Everyone there is filled full with what we would call goodness, as a mirror is filled with light. But they do not call it goodness. They do not call it anything. They are not thinking of it. They are too busy looking at the source from which it comes. Those are people who give themselves permission to see a new face, even in what they are familiar with. So this is not true only in the Christian tradition. In the Buddhist tradition, especially as it moves into the West, because this is something we see. When a faith tradition leaves one culture and moves to the other, it morphs, it changes. We see this with Buddhism in the West. In the East, Buddhism is a lot more kind of denominational. We have Zen Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism. Here in the West, we really don't. It kind of all gels more together. We also see a shift away from a focus on just enlightenment to more of a focus on social justice. Why is that? Because here in the West, we imbue that faith tradition with us, with who we are. We bring ourselves to it. The energy of the culture changes the face of belief and of practice. So what are some of the other faces of God we are seeing? We are seeing an emphasis on the face of God being identified as community. Before, you would sit in a pew and it was your belief and your relationship to God. Now, it is more of an emphasis on God in community, on all of us being the sacred in community. Vietnamese Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh said recently, these days, the Sangha is the Buddha. The Sangha, being the spiritual community, is the Buddha. Many other people share this view, that the enlightened Messiah who has come to save humanity today is not an individual, but a collective awakening. The most reliable teacher is friends meeting friends. Isn't that what we do here? I mean, isn't there a collective wisdom, a collective sacred expression of being in community? And that is a new thing. I suggest that that is one of the other new faces of God we see. The face of all of us in a collective awakening, soul to soul. What is it Martin Luther said? The I-thou, God is in the connection. I am not I individually. I am I because you are you and because we are us. It's all a matter of relationship. And that is a new manifestation of the ever-developing face of God. So this hunger for community, it's giving rise to many new and different forms, even though that involve no God at all. So people are saying, what are you doing a talk on the new face of God? Why are you reading stuff about atheism? Well, because it seemed to me to apply, because it makes sense, because what these folks are doing is calling upon what is human in them. And to me, maybe not to them, but to me, that continues to be an expression of the holy. So I took a look at the phenomenon called Sunday Assembly. Sunday assemblies are way cool. They were started by two British comedians, love it, who saw a need for community but an aversion to traditional religion. Their solution was essentially church without God. Because people who would sit home and say, I don't go to church because I don't believe in God, I don't want to hear all that Jesus stuff, but I don't want it to be just me and my latte. I want to get together with people. I want to support people. I want church, but I don't want God. Will somebody give that to me, please? And so Sunday assemblies were started. Their motto is, listen to this because this is going to make sense to y'all. This could be a Sunday assembly. Their motto is live better, help often, and wonder more. Isn't that great? Live better, help often, and wonder more. The founders have said, quote, the assembly will solace worries, provoke kindness, and inject a touch of transcendence into everyday life. Life can be tough. It is tough. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. We have moments of weakness, or life just isn't there. We want the Sunday assembly to be a house of love and compassion, where no matter what your situation, you are welcomed, accepted, and loved. That is so cool. That is people expressing their wonderful humanity. What does St. Irenaeus said? The best expression of God is a human being fully alive. That is what these folks are striving for, to be fully alive, whether they call it God or not, whether they actively deny God. I don't think that much matters, because they are striving to bring to the fore the best in their humanity. So who goes? Atheists, agnostics, humanists. You're not supposed to call them secular humanists anymore. I also learned this. Humanists. Okay. So these folks are not throwing out morality. They're not throwing out ethical behavior, caring for each other, or our world. What they are rejecting is what they call a belief in the supernatural, the existence of spirits, the causation of the great creator. They are rejecting the image of a separate judgmental being, which so many have rejected, which many of us have rejected. That's not what we see of God. These communities celebrate the belief that morality is independent from theology. That reason will provide our answers. They believe that by engaging in rational, open discussions, we can find objective, universal standards of morality and ethics. I think this is fascinating. That morality is separate from theology. That is something to consider as we think about these things. Morality should be judged on its ability to advance human well-being, dignity, and to create a better world. Now, the emphasis is on this world, not the next world. They're not saying we're going to wait for some reward later on. They're saying this is it. This is all there is. But this is pretty darned amazing. And I'm going to love it and treasure it and pass it on better than I found it. So I leave it to you to decide if Spirit is at work in these gatherings. And as I believe that God is all there is, I believe for me that it is. I am not troubled that they don't see it that way. These gatherings are another way in which creative mind manifests itself, so that we bring our gifts that we were created with and that we benefit from to the world at large. So these are the new faces of God. I can't even articulate all of them, because what the new faces of God are is a possibility for each of us to create it ourselves. We crack open the doors of organized religion, we lay aside the creeds and the doctrines, and what do we get? We see a living Spirit that invites us to find joy and fulfillment, to serve others, to live with peace and compassion, and to preserve our beautiful planet, to pass it on for the generations that follow. When we can do that, when we can lay aside all those places where we don't find God, the rituals, the liturgies, the small acceptable experiences, we become free to open our eyes and just see the divine all around us. So in the coming week, several weeks, I invite you to consider how the face of God appears to you. How has the face of God changed over the years, over the course of your life? How does Spirit now invite you into new relationship and new understanding? Let's take these thoughts into meditation.